This presentation is brought to you by American Civil War and UK History. This is for the Passion of History podcast. This podcast is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get a podcast from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts, and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And just a quick warning that today's episode we will be discussing things that happened during World War II, and so if you are easily upset, please turn off now. Okay, so in today's episode we will be discussing the build-up to the end of VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, and the end of World War II. And joining me to discuss this is Tim Willging. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, Darren. Thanks for having me.
And of course, we have Chris Kolakowski. Welcome, Chris.
Hello, Darren. Good to be here.
So again, we did have a discussion about VE Day a little while back. So go and check that out. Link is in the description as well. But we're going to start off with the fall of the Philippines. So 1944, just the back end of 1944 into the early part of 45, the Philippines campaign. So why did why invade the Philippines? How did the campaign progress, Tim?
So it is an easy question because by this stage of the war, the Americans in particular were having to deal with a lot of inter-service fighting, different view sometimes within services about what Japanese held places to attack and which one's not. So that'll come up during pretty much every battle we'll talk about today. The Philippines, though, were special. Part of it, probably the large part of it, was prior to its conquest by Japanese in 1941, end of 1941 into 1942. The Philippines were a United States territory. So a large part of it was the U.S. felt a deep connection to the Philippines, and also the prisoner of war camps that were there. That was a factor, and it probably goes without saying to a certain degree. A large part of it was Douglas MacArthur and his promise to, when he left, that I shall return. All these things kind of factored in. They had bypassed other areas such as Rabaul in New Guinea, and basically isolated it, allowed it to die on the vine, as it were. But the Philippines had 500,000 troops, and if your ultimate goal and you're envisioning an invasion of mainland Japan, that perhaps is a bit large of a force, and that's probably understating it, to leave in your rear. Yes, the Japanese offensive capability with their navy was damaged and would get even worse during the Philippines campaign. But hindsight being what it is, it's probably easy to say, oh, why did we have to fight this long, horrible campaign from 44 to the end of the war, basically? We could have just bypassed it and, having taken Iwo Jima, Okinawa, potentially maybe targeting Formosa in the future. Wouldn't that set us up better? But we didn't know that. We didn't know what capabilities the Japanese could or didn't have to lash out from the Philippines. What if they tried to, reconquer some of the things that we'd already conquered? And I think that was maybe part of it as well. But the largest part, I'd say, was the ties the Americans had to the archipelago. So it began with the invasion of Leyte, one of the larger islands. That actually went pretty quickly. The largest naval battle of World War II was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and pretty much destroyed a large chunk of what was left of the Japanese naval capability. After Leyte fell, they invaded Luzon on the western side, pushing north and south. First, they really drove south towards Manila. Very bloody street fighting. you got to admire the Japanese defense there. And then after that, they pushed up into the more mountainous passes north of on the northern side of the island. And pretty much those operations lasted until the end of the war.
Okay, Chris, do you want to add anything to that?
So Tim gave a real good summary. I just want to amplify a couple of points, particularly with the strategic debate. In the Pacific, by this point, in the summer of 1944, when they're deciding where to go, there are two drives across the Pacific: Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific Forces and Douglas MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area. Coming up from Australia, MacArthur is. Coming out of Honolulu, straight across, is Nimitz. The objective, which has never been specifically defined until the summer of 1944, is the general triangle of Luzon, Formosa, modern Taiwan, and the China coast, to seize an objective somewhere in there. And the reason that they want that objective is they want to cut the home islands of Japan, which sit about 1,500 miles straight north from Manila, from the resources that the Japanese require to keep their war machine running, which are all in the southern part of the Japanese Empire at this point. What we know today is Malaysia, what we know today is Indonesia, and Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, that area. So how are you going to strangle those supply lines? And it comes down to a debate between invading Formosa. It comes down to a debate invading the Philippines. And Tim's already summarized a lot of this arguments. One of the things that should be mentioned is the largest anti-Axis resistance in the entire world, except for the Polish Home Army, was the Philippines. There were 250,000 Filipino guerrillas that were under arms awaiting MacArthur's return. And they and the Filipino population in general were a tremendous, to use a term of art, force multiplier. The ground commander designate, who we will talk more about in another context a little bit later, for the Formosa invasion was Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. And he pointed out that for all of the debate, all this discussion, he said, look, I can take Formosa, but I need reinforcements. I need service units and I need service support units from the United States. And all of those units in the United States are on their way to Europe. They're earmarked for Europe. And of course, what's the great Allied priority? It's Germany first. And that ultimately is one of the key dominoes that falls that turns the argument in favor of the Philippines, is that Nimitz and MacArthur both say, look, we can take the Philippines with our current resources. And of course, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, War Department, the British are not going to stop the war in Europe to take an island in the Pacific. And so that's something, as you think about the debate, that should be mentioned is for all the conversation, there was a lot that went into the decision. Resources, that question of resources and support made a big difference. I'll also say one other thing. The United States is alone among all of the colonial powers got back and liberated our colonies before the end of the war. In other words, MacArthur's promise was kept. And if you want to know why the United States is such a trusted partner in Asia today, that is a big reason why. For much of the world, 1945, certainly in Far East, 1945 is yesterday. And this reverberates, this may seem like ancient history, but this reverberates in Asia today.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Okay, Tim, what stands out about the campaign, Tim?
I think just the first is the sheer complexity of it. There's thousands. Most people forget this. The Philippines archipelago is made up of thousands of islands. Yes, we're only attacking really a few of them, but that is daunting. It's a logistical challenge to resource that. There's ultimately two armies and multiple fleets involved. In addition, you have the Allied air forces as well. But you have the 6th Army under Walter Kruger. You have the 8th Army under Robert Eichelberger fighting there. So it's a very large operation. I think it's well over 500,000 men involved it's actually over 1 million men on the Allied side. And the islands are held by almost 500,000+ Japanese. Ultimately, almost all of those Japanese, was common in the Pacific War, would become casualties, killed, wounded, mainly, mostly captured. not captured, mostly killed. And the Americans suffered 72,000 casualties. So given the size and scale of it, it's one of the largest combat efforts or largest operations that the United States, yes, it has allies, Filipino guerrillas, are a force multiplier there, as Chris mentioned. But from an American perspective, it's one of the largest operations we undertake during World War II. And I think what's fascinating about it is how ignored it has become. Very few people today really talk about it. Those that are familiar with military history, they overlook it. And among the general populace, it wouldn't surprise me if most haven't even heard of it. But it was one of the largest and bloodiest campaigns that America fought. And given the forces that we encountered there, it's one of our best operational achievements, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. What was it strategically for Japan? What did they get out of the Philippines, Tim?
They did get resources out of there. They created another republic that fell with the fall of the Philippines after it was recaptured in 1945. But they could use this as a staging area. They could house prisoners of war there. They got resources out of there. It is an abundant island or island chain archipelago, with an abundance of resources. So they used it for that. It also struck it at American morale because it was a U.S. possession. And they could use it as a staging area for their onward movement.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Do you want to add anything about the campaign there, Chris?
I think Tim summed it up very well. 8th Army in the southern and central Philippines, 38 amphibious landings in 44 days. As a matter of fact, this is the largest U.S. Army troop commitment in the entire Pacific War and second in the world only to the advance from the beaches of Normandy into central Germany, which we talked about in the last episode. The one other thing I'll mention about what did the Japanese get out of the Philippines and why is the Philippines valuable to both sides? In addition to its geographic positioning relative to the sea lines in the South China Sea, which are a factor today, Manila is one of the best situated ports in the Far East, and it was one of the best ports in the Far East and still is one of the better ones in the Far East. You're only 500 miles from the China coast. You're 600 miles from Hong Kong, 500 miles to Formosa, 1,000 miles maybe to Singapore. You're right in the middle of everything. And so Manila became a very important transshipment point for the Japanese back and forth. The air bases as well, and particularly in central Luzon. As a matter of fact, during the strategic debate, one of the Army commanders was asked by a Navy commander, do you want to make a London out of Manila? In other words, do you want to make this the springboard for, what are you trying to do here? Are you trying to make it the capital, it is play a role just like London did in Europe? And he said, no, I want to make an England out of Luzon. And what he meant by that was, and this was coming to fruition when the war ends, the main base for the invasion of the Japanese home islands was Manila and Luzon and the central Philippines. That was under construction when the war ended. And so for both sides, the port, the air bases, the strategic location makes the Philippines a highly desirable objective. And I would argue that geographically, that geographic reality remains today.
Yeah, and again, so that's what they gain from it. They gain that list, that base to be able to launch the next step. Right. Okay, let's change tack slightly and move to February 45, and Stalin is going to commit to entering the Pacific War. So just tell us a little bit about that. Chris.
So the Yalta Conference, most people, when they focus on the Yalta Conference, which is the last meeting of the Big Three, Franklin Roosevelt has just a few weeks to live in the center there. Winston Churchill on the left will be voted out of office in July of 1945. And then, of course, Generalissimo Stalin on the right there from the Soviet Union. Most of their agenda is focused on ending the war in Europe, but one of the things that needs to be kept in mind, particularly when you think about the ask of Stalin and getting the commitment from the Soviets to enter the war against Japan. You should never ever forget that in early 1945, in February of 1945, they didn't know how it was going to end. There was no guarantee that the atomic bomb was even going to be available. There was no guarantee. No, in fact, most planning documents from all the theaters, Nimitz, MacArthur, and even the China-Burma India Theater, assume the war is going to progress into 1946, if not 1947. And so the idea is, how do you destroy the Japanese most effectively? And one of the things that needs to be mentioned is that the Japanese, when they surrender in 1945, have 5 million soldiers deployed outside the home islands, about half of which are in China. So you have this very large Japanese army that potentially could be available for transfer to the home islands to fight a potential invasion. By bringing the Soviets in, you keep that army on the continent of Asia, and therefore it's less Japanese that you have to fight on the home islands. That's the thinking. And so that's the thinking behind the request for the Soviets to come in. And ultimately they will, exactly 90 days after Germany surrenders, which was the early morning hours of May 9th, 1945. And so 90 days later, August 9th, 1945, and we can talk about this a little bit later, the Soviets are going to commit major forces into an offensive into Manchuria and northern China.
Mm-hmm. Tim, do you want to add anything to that, mate?
No, I think Chris summed it up pretty good.
Anyway, so February 1945 is important for the Americans, because you're going to have one of the first major battles, and that is the Battle of Hiroshima, which is a tiny little island, I believe. Is that right? And so what's so important about Hiroshima for the Japanese, and why attack Hiroshima, Tim?
Well, Japanese have an airfield there. They've been using it throughout the war. But it's a Japanese possession, so there's a symbolic nature for it. The Allies want it for a couple of reasons. They've been looking at it's part of the volcano islands. They're below Japan, but the biggest reason they want to use it as a fighter base to basically support long-range bombers. And also as a place for bombers to use for emergency landings. And the argument's made that they basically can't do it without it. It would reduce the death toll. So that's probably the biggest reason they want it. The Japanese assign I'll get into that later, but they assign relatively large number of forces for a relatively small island to defend it. So they view it as a way to potentially slow down the Allied advance, or the largely American advance there in that part of the Pacific. Whereas the Allies want it for that logistical / operational area, mainly for the fighters. And that's the big American goal with Iwo Jima.
Mm-hmm. Chris, anything to add there, mate?
No, I think Tim summed it up very, very well. The Iwo Jima and Okinawa, for both the Japanese and the Americans, are outposts. They're securing outposts, which are kind of the last step. Everybody understands that these two operations, which are concurrent with the liberation of the Philippines, are going to be the last step before the home islands. And so they're trying to secure positions. Of course, the Japanese are trying to bleed the Allies and hold those positions if possible. But ultimately, everybody is fighting these battles with an eye toward an ultimate invasion of the Japanese home islands.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Tim, take us through the battle, my friend, and explain, because it was quite a horrendous battle, wasn't it?
It was. So the battle is, essentially the pride and joy of the United States Marine Corps, and for good reason. This is primarily a Marine Corps effort, though I will start from the beginning and state that there was an Army Infantry Regiment attached to the Marines. So the Marines, it's all under the auspices of Raymond Spruance. He's the Chief Naval Commander. Ground forces are led by are comprised of a task force known as Task Force 56 under Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, who had led operations earlier in the war, mainly at Peleliu. But that task force consists of one corps, the 5th Amphibious Corps under Major General Harry Schmidt, and the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions are that's the weight behind this. They do not conduct they have a artillery bombardment, air bombardment. However, it isn't as long as some would have liked. In relative terms, it is not that long. That will be one of the major lessons learned, that future operations need to have a much more extensive artillery bombardment. The Marines move ashore. I think it's the 5th Division first, but don't quote me on that. And initially, there is really no fire. The Japanese exercise remarkable fire discipline. And when the beach is packed, they open fire, and that increases, casualties rapidly mount. From there, the Americans are stuck and packed on the beach. It's a very steep slope off the beach. They actually have to bring in bulldozers and create roads. And then after that, the Marines begin to file out. Early on during this phase, actually one of the more tragic episodes in trying to take out a Japanese bunker that was pinning down his men, the Marines' first well-known Medal of Honor recipient of World War II, John Basilone, is killed. He had actually been fighting for a couple of years to get back to the war. So he's killed on the first day of, back in combat there at Iwo Jima. The goal is to secure the airfield, because that's the whole point of the operation. After that's done, they move to clear Mount Suribachi on the southern end of the island, which they do. The Japanese are very entrenched. General Kurabayashi is the commander of the Japanese forces, and he's basically been spending his time since he arrived several months prior, building very elaborate secure fortifications inside the mountains, or inside the hills, inside Mount Suribachi. Uses a lot of concrete pillboxes, a lot of underground things, different things that we've seen already throughout the war up to this point, with the Japanese becoming very adept at burrowing into the ground and camouflaging themselves in positions that can be resistant to bombardment. And you'll see that again in Okinawa just a few months later. But eventually the Marines are able to clear Mount Suribachi. And that's when the famous flag raising that you see on pretty much anything and everything Marine Corps. Secretary of the Navy Forrestal is actually watching offshore, and he says that will guarantee the Marine Corps for another 1,000 years. And to a great extent, he's right. The Marine Corps, it is assessed by many that the Marine Corps may not, their efforts, achievements at Iwo Jima allowed the Marine Corps to survive moving forward, when there was efforts, and has been since, to get rid of it, saying, what is the country in its second land force? Well, the performance of the Marine Corps in the Pacific, and particularly at Iwo Jima, answer that question. They are a very adept amphibious force, and they were great at these shock operations to seize these islands in the Pacific. And Iwo Jima is kind of the shining example. It's the largest operation they undertake, with the 3 divisions attacking there. And it, while it's incredibly bloody and costly, relatively speaking, especially compared to other operations, namely Peleliu, it is over relatively quickly, a little over a month. I mean, it's a small island, but they take it in just about 5 weeks. All told, the entire Japanese garrison is lost. In the Marine Corps, out of the 110,000 American forces employed there, almost 30,000 are killed or wounded or otherwise injured in the battle. So, roughly 30% casualties for the Americans. So that's essentially Iwo Jima in a nutshell.
Yeah. And Chris, anything you want to add about Hiroshima, my friend?
I think that was a great summary. To understand Marine Corps identity today, you have to understand the Battle of Iwo Jima. Tim is absolutely right about that.
Yeah. And again, I'm not going to disappoint you, Tim, because I do have a photograph of that iconic moment.
There you go.
And I was saving it because it's such an important moment in US history. And of course, as you know, is it in DC? Because I think I've seen it myself. I did take a picture of it.
It's just north of Arlington Cemetery.
That's it. Yeah. So we have this amazing monument to that.
And the entire Marine Corps Museum is shaped to resemble that. So it really is embedded into everything about the Marine Corps.
Yeah, and I believe there was a film made about that in the 2000s. Where
Flags of Our Fathers.
That's it. Yeah, took the picture of that, and I think Clint Eastwood directed that movie.
He did, and the Japanese perspective.
Yeah, that's right. Letters from Iwo Jima.
Yeah, Letters from Iwo Jima. Both of them are outstanding portrayals of the fighting forces on the island.
Yeah.
Yep.
But 30% casualties. Whoa, that is really, really, really horrendous.
Especially for a World War II battle.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. Okay, so and again, this is what is awaiting, anyone that's gonna, and we'll get onto that in a minute, that wants to even think about invading mainland Japan. Okay, so why is Hiroshima debated through the present day, Tim?
Well, part of it is because a lot of people say that it never accomplished its purpose. And to an extent, they're true. The super fortresses, as they were coming back, the new B-29s, found that they didn't need to detour to the island. It did neutralize their attacks against the Marianas. The Japanese lost that capability. But there were relatively few, there were a couple thousand landings on Iwo Jima, but they could have come from elsewhere was the point. So basically the reason it's debated is because it was like the casualties were so horrendous, 30% roughly, that it basically, to use a parlance, the juice wasn't worth the squeeze on that. So basically, and when they actually, so I said the 2000 number of B-29 landings, most were not for emergency purposes. Only about 1/5 of those, a little over 2,000 landings were there. 80% were for routine refueling, and that could have been accomplished anywhere else. And so goes the argument there. The Allies had proven that they could cut off and isolate Japanese outposts. So the question is, well, if we can isolate something as big and valuable as Rabaul, why couldn't we isolate Iwo Jima? And for that reason, the losses and the fact that maybe we didn't actually have to have it after all is why it's been debated through to the present day.
Mm-hmm. What about yourself, Chris? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Tim sums it up very, very well. The debate will never be conclusive. To the airmen that it saved their life, they'll answer it one way. To Marines who fought on that island, they may answer it another way. One thing that should be mentioned is the P-51s that are based on that airstrip help sweep the skies over Japan of fighter forces. We've talked about before in another episode about the USAAF when they got the P-51s over Germany and what that meant. And the P-51s based out of Iwo did some really, really great work in the skies over Japan. So, from that perspective, to me, it's not necessarily an either or, and that may be a perspective that needs to be considered. But
right.
The debate will go on. It's never going to be resolved one way or the other. And I get all sides.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to this really, really important battle and brutal and costly campaign for both sides, and that is the Battle of Okinawa. Why was it so? Why invade this island, Tim? Yeah.
Once again, so it is a Japanese-held island, even though they are a distinct ethnic group. The Okinawans are Okinawans. It's a mix of, Japanese, Chinese, local people. Correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but they are a distinct ethnic group within Japan.
That is correct.
But it is considered part of mainland Japan, or not mainland Japan. It is considered a Japanese home island in effect. It also, it's close enough as to be a potential staging area for Operation. Is it Downfall was going to be the name of?
Correct. Yep.
Downfall was going to be the name of the operation to invade the Japanese home islands, and we knew we needed one of those. So basically, it came down to Okinawa or Formosa. And Formosa, of course, being modern day Taiwan. So Nimitz ended up backing the idea that it should be Okinawa. They argued it. At one point, he did flip to Formosa, but end of the day, it's Okinawa. It's a little bit closer. That has its advantages and disadvantages. It's closer to Japan. That works also for the Japanese. They can strike from Japan and send reinforcements or attempt to send naval forces, and they attempt to. But from a U.S. perspective, they're planning on particularly using the Kidane airfield to participate in Operation Downfall to provide aerial cover and bombardment of the Japanese home islands.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk about the major commanders. What were their backgrounds and what did they bring to the battle, Chris?
So for both sides, this is considered a full dress rehearsal for the invasion of the home islands itself. Okinawa, as Tim is right, 350 miles from southern Japan, 350 miles from China, 500 miles from Formosa. It's the closest island to the home islands itself that has yet been attacked. And these are the senior American commanders that are going to be involved in the campaign. Chester Nimitz there on the left, one of our greatest admirals, this is really in many ways the culminating battle of his Central Pacific drive from Honolulu all the way across that we've alluded to earlier. The guy immediately to his right is Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., who had best been known for being the commander of forces in Alaska as part of the Aleutians campaign. That was all his aegis. And then in 1944, he'd been appointed commander of U.S. 10th Army, and he's going to be the ground commander for Okinawa. He will not survive the battle. He will be killed by artillery fire on June 18th, 1945, watching Marines, as a matter of fact, go into action. And he will be the senior American killed by enemy fire in World War II and in the entirety of the 20th century. He will ultimately, as commander of 10th Army, be permanently replaced by the guy to his right. That's General Joseph Stilwell, who had been commander in the China-Burma India Theater, had been relieved in October 1944, brought back to Washington, and then was appointed by the Chief of Staff, George Marshall, to command 10th Army, expecting that there's going to be an invasion of Japan, and he wants Stilwell to be involved in that. In between, the interim commander and the only aviator, the only Marine and the only aviator of any service to ever command a field army in combat is this guy on the far right, probably my favorite Marine general, Roy Geiger. Extremely experienced commander, extremely experienced aviation and ground officer, had conducted quite a few campaigns, and people forget that 10th Army of the 183,000 men that come ashore on the 1st of April 1945 at the beginning of the Battle of Okinawa, almost half are Marines. And that percentage will remain essentially true all the way through the battle. So it's an Army-Marine show. And one of the reasons it goes so well, you don't have the inter-service squabbles that you do in other battles and other places, is because of the personal relationship between Buckner and Geiger. They actually had known each other in the 1920s when both of them attended Fort Leavenworth at the Command and General Staff School. So they got to know each other, had always kept in touch. And when Geiger was appointed, in fact, Buckner said, if something ever happens to me, I want General Geiger to take over. So that should tell you what you need to know about the feelings between the men. But this is a great command team. They do great work. and fight and win. Just an incredible battle. In many ways, it's ranked the largest sea air land battle in the history of warfare.
Hmm. And so also their kamikazes are so prominent in this battle as well, aren't they? So what are their impact, Chris?
So the Japanese adopt a similar strategy to Iwo Jima. The commander opposing Buckner is a guy named Mitsuru Ushijima, who had been the commander of the Japanese military academy before he took over the defense of Okinawa. He's got about 120,000 people. The vast majority of them he digs into the southern third of the island and honeycombs it just like on Iwo Jima, just a much larger version. And his idea is the same thing: is bleed the Americans ashore, while at the same time kamikazes and regular attacks, the several thousand planes in southern Japan, will hit the American and British fleet. We shouldn't forget the British Pacific Fleet is part of the American forces or part of the Allied forces off the island. And the idea is to do so much damage, both ashore and afloat, that the Americans will just have to give up. It doesn't work that way, but the damage they do is significant. 36 ships sunk, 368 ships damaged, and on ashore, all casualties above the island, on the island, or in the waters around, 49,000 casualties. If you count psychological casualties, it's 76,000 casualties.
Wow.
And you can see the effects of some of the kamikazes here. It's USS Bunker Hill there on the upper right. That's HMS Formidable there on the upper left. The British had armored flight decks. They could carry less planes, but the British carriers had armored flight decks. So even though it looks pretty bad for Formidable, within 30 minutes, she was back resuming flight operations. Wow. And it was incredible. And then I want to direct real quick, if I may, Daz, I just want to point out that lower center photograph, which is the ultimate kamikaze for the Japanese. Because when we think of kamikazes, it's primarily air. But the Japanese did send the Yamato, along with a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, in other words, the most powerful battleship afloat, on a one-way trip to Okinawa on April 6, 1945. And when I mean one way, I mean they filled the fuel bunkers halfway. And the idea was fight through the Americans, and if you actually make it to the island, beach and become a floating coastal battery. It's a suicide mission. But the Japanese, it tells you the desperation the Japanese felt to commit their super battleship, the last great asset of the Japanese Navy. And on April 7th, American aircraft, over several hours, sink Yamato, 24 bombs, 19 torpedoes, and as she goes down, that's her blowing up. Her magazines blow up just at the surface. Of the 3,300 men that go on the mission, only 330 are picked up as survivors. So it is just but it says something about the lengths that the Japanese are going to as the front line is nearing the home islands, and the sense of desperation that they are feeling and are detected by the Americans and by the British, the Allied leaders, as the battle progresses.
Yeah, and again, like you're saying, if this is a dress rehearsal, imagine what it'd be like invading mainland Japan, And so obviously we're going to get onto that later on about what they're going to do to stop that from happening. But Tim, anything to add there about the battle for that island there?
Chris covered it pretty well. I do want to mention the Yamato operation. That was I think they call it Operation Tengo.
Yep,
was its name. It had several destroyers as well that were also lost. But the scale of the U.S. response I've always found really impressive, because the Yamato is struck. It's really it's impressively coordinated. I smile not about the loss of life, but impressive, well executed military operations are kind of my thing. And it's 300 aircraft attacking it. They coordinated with those that torpedo bombers, because we finally figured out by this stage how to make torpedoes work. At Midway, not so much. By this operation, they're much better at it. They talk to pilots to be like, only attack one side of the ship to prevent counterflooding, basically with the intention, because typically what you do if you get a hole in a ship, you flood the other side to balance it out so you don't list too heavily, cause a rollover. if you inflict if you keep striking the same side, basically there isn't enough that you can counterflood, and that's exactly what happens. The ship starts to roll over, it gets to a certain point, the magazines explode, and ends it. But just the scale of how they were able to target that ship. Also, in other areas, they're just people overlook the naval aspect of the Battle of Okinawa to a degree. Just the sheer exhaustion that the sailors had to feel, because for a good, I think, several weeks, Chris, they were under nearly constant kamikaze attacks. So you're talking red alerts constantly.
I'd say about 8 to 10 weeks, Tim. Yeah, you're right.
Having to just be on duty over and over and over. You're now having to deal with combat fatigue, and ship, admirals have to be rotated out, ships and crews have to be rotated in and out. And then not to mention the damage inflicted, I think 4,000 sailors killed, 4,000 wounded. And that's just the naval aspect alone. And then once again, and this goes into calculation moving forward, it's roughly a third of the ground forces, I think, are casualties in this battle as well. So you've got a third at Iwo Jima, a third at Okinawa. Now there's nothing left but to go for Japan. And you're looking at needing a couple million men, and you're talking a third. And you're expecting, and the kamikaze effort, because where are these pilots coming from? They're coming from the Japanese populace. These are relatively young guys, minimal flight training, just willing to, take a plane up and crash it. And they're coming from the home islands. So now what are you going to be dealing with when you get to home islands? And Okinawa kind of provides part of that answer that they're going to use moving forward. I don't want to get ahead of myself, though.
No. And obviously, I'm looking at the dates here. So it starts on April the 1st and finishes in June 1945. So obviously, for that first month, you've still got one eye on Europe. So at this point, when they get into this huge battle and they realise it's this big, and like you're just saying there, Tim, if you want to invade the home islands, you've got to be looking at up to 1 million people. They must be panicking at this point of thinking, oh, God, how are we going to do this?
Yep.
Wow. Okay, so I just want to ask, Chris, where does this battle rank among the war's greatest battles?
In many ways, it's the culmination of the Pacific War. It wasn't intended to be, but it is. It's the largest and bloodiest sea-air-land combat in the history of the world. The military is studying it today as as one of the examples of a potential battle of Taiwan in the future. God forbid it ever gets fought. But again, a full dress rehearsal for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. Winston Churchill said, as long as American military history is written, Okinawa will be regarded as one of its most famous and one of America's best battles, because of the determination of what it took. Almost 90 days to secure the island, but at the same time secured, a very important base. American forces are still there. We've actually never left in 80 years. Okinawa is still an extremely important Pacific base, and was even during Korea and Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Okay, before we move on to the next topic, I just want to bring back these guys, because I want to talk about Mr. Buckner, because Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., Chris, he's got a tie to the American Civil War, has he? So tell us about that.
So Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., who, shameless plug, is the subject of my last book, 10th Army Commander.
Not shameless, plug away.
There you go. It's right over my shoulder, too, by the way. His father was Simon Bolivar Buckner of the Civil War, had been a Confederate general, West Point graduate, was governor of Kentucky. He had married his second wife and fathered Buckner Jr. when Buckner Sr. was 62. And Buckner Sr. encouraged his son to become a general. In fact, in many ways, to understand Buckner Jr.'s life perspectives, what he's all about, you have to understand the career of his father. And his father helped get him into West Point. And then, of course, his father dies in 1914, and Buckner Jr. obviously continues on. But if you read his Buckner Jr.'s writings, you find quotes about his father, you find remembrances about his father. In fact, the day that Okinawa was invaded, happened to be the anniversary of his father's birth on April 1st, 1823. And he writes that in his diary, that this is my father's birthday and we're going ashore in Okinawa. So that tells you something about, the relationship between father and son, even though the father obviously has been passed for many decades by that point. But it's a fascinating connection, and it illustrates how, for us, 1945 is 80 years ago. For 1945, 1865 was 80 years ago.
Yeah.
And when you think about how
I
there's
love
still
that analogy.
Yeah.
and thank you. When you think about how World War II vets are still around, or how immediate World War II is, we've already talked about that a little bit. For the World War II generation, particularly somebody like Buckner Jr., the Civil War is immediate and is still very much with us. And you find that particularly among a lot of the senior leaders, George Patton, Lucius Clay, some of these others, the experience of the Civil War and their families in the Civil War guide and inspire them as they fight and win World War II.
Yeah.
And Buckner Jr., tremendous example of that too.
And again, it's only sort of one generation, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
How fascinating. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to this. So this is known as the Potsdam Declaration, which is an ultimatum demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. It is issued. What is the significance about the Potsdam Declaration, Tim?
I'd say it's consistent is the big thing. The Americans always took a little bit of offense with the Europe First strategy. And what came out of that, the agreement that we would accept no less than the unconditional surrender of Germany. So at the Potsdam Conference, which is the first conference that involves Truman instead of Roosevelt, we demand Japan's unconditional surrender. So I'd argue that that's the biggest thing, is that we get the Allies to agree to that. It's basically confirmed that the Soviets are going to be involved. But its significance to me is that consistency.
Mm-hmm. And they reject this, don't they, Chris? So tell us a little bit more about that.
So just to piggyback off what Tim just said, I want to put this in a timeline for everybody, because there are several very important milestones on the road in June, July 1945. The first one is a meeting that occurs June 18th, 1945, where they do the first planning and the first serious estimates for the invasion of the Japanese home islands. What's it really going to take? And they use the math at Okinawa, they use the math at some of these other battles, and that's where they start to realize that the home islands, this could be really, really bad. There could be a lot of blood. And by the way, if you haven't noticed, the casualty figures we've been quoting, notice how the battles are getting bloodier the closer you get to Japan in the Pacific. So there's that. The other thing is, then you get to July 16th, 1945, in Trinity, which is the successful test of the atomic bomb. Truman gets word of it when he arrives at Potsdam. So it is with that in mind, and he tells Stalin and he tells Churchill, later Clement Attlee, because the election happens during the conference. So it is with that in the back of their mind that the big three get together and say, we're going to issue this proclamation and demand unconditional surrender, but we're going to leave open the possibility that the emperor may survive, may continue to rule. We should never forget that Japan, up to this point, two things that need to be mentioned. Number one, Japan, in its 2,600 years, has never lost a war. Number two, until August 15th, 1945, most Japanese believed that the emperor was a living god, and that if you looked him in the eye, you went blind. Okay? So those things need to be remembered. And so the idea is we have to give Japan an out. It won't be a pure unconditional surrender, but at the same time, they need to understand that if they don't pack it in now, and there were some peace feelers that were coming informally through the Soviet Union and all this other stuff, if they don't pack it in now, they hint at the fact that the bomb will be used. The Japanese get this, and they greet it with, I believe it's called Shiran Kao, death by silence. Japanese government is tremendously divided. In the Japanese governmental structure, the military has an outsized voice compared to the other civilian cabinet members. And there's tremendous division about what to do. And so they basically pocket veto it and they don't respond. That is interpreted in the West as a rejection. And on August 3rd, 1945, the commander of the Pacific Air Forces, Carl Spaatz, who has come from Europe, and by the way, 8th Army and Bomber Command are starting on their way across the world, destined for Okinawa and a role in the invasion of Japan. Spaatz gets orders to use the bombs when he feels it is possible, in the next 10 days, if possible.
Wow. Okay. So again, when they actually obviously harness this power in these bombs that they're going to eventually drop, what is the reaction from the government? Because they're pushing it. Obviously, they're pushing this, aren't they? And they're obviously backing this. But like you said, when they're going to this Potsdam as well, so do Churchill and Stalin know that America have this power to drop a bomb of this more magnitude? What is known? Because I know it's a secret, isn't it, Chris?
It was a tremendous state secret, but once the test was done, the British actually had contributed scientific knowledge, and even then, intelligence sharing between Britain and the United States was almost transparent, just like the special relationship, just like it has been ever since.
Okay.
Truman told Stalin at the meeting, and was surprised when Stalin didn't act all that surprised. We now know Stalin had spies that were keeping him informed of what was going on at Los Alamos before the test. But Stalin was like, okay, great. Let's, see what we can do with it type thing. So there was this understanding among all three of them that this weapon exists. It's on the table as for potential use, and we should factor it into our plans.
Okay, and so that is the plan, like you said. So the first bomb arrives, and the plan is on the 6th of August to drop the first one on a city in Japan called Hiroshima, and it's called Little Boy. And so, Tim, tell us about the first atomic bomb that's ever dropped anywhere in history.
So, once again, gotta go back to the calculus. So what you're looking at with Japan is a militia alone, the militia of 25 million people and armed forces of about 2.5 million. What that translates to in the calculus is anywhere in the range from like 50,000 US dead, not casualties, to 1.4 to 4 million casualties total in invading the Japanese home islands, potentially just the main one, I think Kyushu. So they decide that, the bomb, and on top of that, you're looking at potentially 5 to 10 million Japanese citizens being killed based on the 100,000 Japanese citizens or Okinawans that are killed during the Battle of Okinawa. So all this is there. So some have speculated that we didn't know. We knew that the bomb was going to be really, really powerful, but we didn't know exactly what it would do. I don't know that I buy that completely. I think we didn't know the extent, whether it could destroy a whole city or not. But we did say that it had to be a target that was larger than 3 miles in diameter. We knew that the blast wave was going to create damage. And we determined that it was going to be attacked sometime in August. Hiroshima was an embarkation port, an industrial center, and home of a military headquarters, so that favored that. We didn't want to go firebomb Tokyo, or we'd been firebombing Tokyo and other Japanese cities, but we didn't want to do this on Tokyo. So it was going to be other cities. Another one was going to be another called Kokura, I think, and then Kyoto was another major industrial center. They later replaced that on the target list with Nagasaki. But round about that time, the Soviets were invading. Some have argued that we dropped it in part because we didn't want the Soviets to get too much credit and take too big a slice of, influence in the Pacific. I don't know that I buy that either. I think in U.S. calculus we've taken Okinawa. The only place to go now is the main islands, and we're looking at over 1 million casualties. So even if we destroy a whole city, the rest of it, and if that forces Japanese capitulation, ultimately we save lives, not just American, but those of our enemies as well.
Mm-hmm. Chris, what's it like for these guys when they're told that they're going on this mission? And I mean, this is historic, isn't it? Do they know the significance of this, and how are they briefed about what they're about to do?
They do. The unit that is involved is the 509th Composite Unit. It had been training since 1944. They've flown a couple of practice missions over Japan. Most of the Japanese think it's a reconnaissance flight. The commander is the guy in the center right there below the name Enola Gay, Paul Tibbets, who's a veteran of the bomber offensive in Europe. Extremely capable air commander, trains that unit very well. There's no question they know exactly what they're about. Their security is insane. They're basically segregated from all the other B-29 crews in the Marianas. So they know they're special. They know they're here to do something special. And actually, the best evidence of that is when they're on their way and they're getting close to Hiroshima, Tibbets has been ordered to record their dialogue. And so he flicks on the recorder and says, "From now on, it's for history. Watch your language."
Oh, wow.
So they know exactly what they're here to do, and they know what they're about. And there's a couple of people, particularly flying support aircraft and weather planes. There's one guy from Wisconsin. We have his account in our collection at the Veterans Museum. He says, "We knew we had a chance to end the war. We knew that was what we were working on, and we wanted to try to end the war."
Mm-hmm. That is, yeah, that's really cool. And is that recording available to listen to anywhere?
Smithsonian's got it now.
Okay, yeah.
I'm sure it's online. They're putting the way they've been putting everything online the last few years. I'm sure it's there.
Yeah, amazing. Wow. And again, obviously, it is dropped, like we said, on the 6th of August, and there is a picture of the bomb being dropped and the aftermath and the huge mushroom cloud that we're all used to seeing if we've seen documentaries about this and that. Tim, what kind of devastation does this cause to the city of Hiroshima and the people living there?
I mean, the city's destroyed. The radiation causes those who aren't immediately killed suffer radiation injuries. The initial, their fires are started throughout the city as a result. There were actually 12 Americans that were killed, having been imprisoned in military headquarters in the city. But you also, had the fires in the city carried a lot of ash into the atmosphere, and then a black rain fell that contained radioactive fallout, ash, water, causing severe radiation burns as well. So the damage to Hiroshima was total, and it was horrific.
Mm-hmm. And how much do they take note after this one, Chris, in Tokyo and the emperor and everything? What's their, their reactions? This must have been horrendous, obviously, but
it takes them at least a half a day to figure out what happened, because Hiroshima is the headquarters for the entire western side of Japan, for the defense forces of the entire western half of Japan. So when that headquarters goes away, not only can the subordinates not suddenly not talk to their bosses, but the people in Tokyo who would normally call the Second General Army headquarters, as it's known, normally would call them and say, "Hey, what's going on?" They can't call them either. So it takes at least a half a day for them to figure out what's happened. And to be honest, the militarists are looking at the situation and saying, you know what? First of all, it can't be one bomb. Second of all, they've done this to most of our other cities already, too. I mean, the Tokyo fire raids, the 3 Tokyo fire raids, and then you look at what the B-29s had already done to Osaka, Nagoya, many of the other cities, particularly on Honshu. that have been burned out. In many cases, 75% or more of their downtowns and central areas have been burned out. So for them, there's still this, how is this different from a fire raid?
Mhm.
They're going to get a new education in just a few days.
Yeah, so they don't really actually know. They don't know what it is.
Well, the one Japanese admiral, if I may, Darren,
Yeah.
Admiral Somu Toyota, that he's the chief of the Naval General Staff, basically estimated that no more than one or two more bombs could be created. So he was very flippant about it and basically decided that Japan was going to endure any remaining attacks. And this was, we were aware that they were saying this. And a lot of that is overlooked for those who choose to criticize the U.S., who don't buy the casualty argument. They ignore that intel was basically pointing that the Japanese were just like us. So what? We're going to just deal with this.
Wow. Anyway, yeah. So the Soviet Union obviously does declare war, like you said. And so we're going to change away from the bombing quickly for a moment. And they do invade Manchuria. And, how much does this help, the Allied forces and the surrender of Japan? Chris?
So this is a giant shock. We need to understand two things about this. Number one, the Japanese had been trying to use the Soviets as a way to broker, the peace feelers. We talked about that before Potsdam. But the other thing that needs to be mentioned is that Japan had really made its bones as a world power, as a power in Asia, by beating the Russians in 1905. And for a lot of the senior leaders in Japan, they are veterans of that war. And then Japan goes and fights the Russians again in 1918 and 1919. They fought them again in 1939. Russia is very much the big enemy. And even during the Pacific War, the Japanese had kept significant forces in Manchuria and in North China in case the Russians tried to do something. Of course, there was the whole debate in 1941 when the Germans invade the Soviet Union. Do the Japanese follow suit? So, given that psychological position that Russia holds among Imperial Japanese military and leaders, it's a shock when the Soviets enter the war and very quickly begin to push the vaunted Kwantung Army. Well, you can see the arrows on the map there and how they launch a variety of concentric attacks. Many of these units, by the way, had been transferred from Germany. They had been in on the kill for Nazi Germany, and they had transferred, and the commanders had transferred, and are now going to be in at the kill of Imperial Japan. And you can see how they keep going. And actually, the Russians don't stop. The Russians, this is about 3 weeks worth of campaigning. That only ends really at the end of August. But just looking at the map illustrates the titanic nature of the Soviet victory, and that shocks Japan. That really shocks the Japanese, and they realize that there's no help. There's nobody else out there. All their lifelines have been expended, and they're either going to sink or swim with the ship that they have.
Yeah, and at this point, like you said, they're literally on their own. And again, going back to that point about they've just come over from Europe. Now, they've just fought some campaign in Europe, and they're battle hardened and they're ready. And so I should imagine the people in Manchuria or the armies there haven't really had that sort of battle experience when it comes to the Japanese, I suppose.
That's absolutely right. And
Yeah.
all you got to do is look at the order of battle of the three Soviet fronts, the first and second Far East and the Trans-Baikal, and you will see names and units that if you know anything about the war between the Germans and the Soviets, you will see a lot of units that, oh, I recognize that, or oh, that person is prominent, that sort of thing. You're right. These are battle-hardened troops. Frankly, the Kwantung Army, a lot of their best units had been transferred to the islands to fight the Americans. And the collapse of the Japanese resistance plus the entry of the Soviets and the performance of the Soviets, it really shocks Japan.
Mm-hmm. And as we've said previously, August the 9th, 1945 is really going to make the Japanese really think about their surrender. And so the next bomb is going to be dropped called Fat Man on Nagasaki. And obviously, as I said, the Soviets continue their offensive at the same time. But this really does really bring the Japanese to the surrender table, doesn't it, Tim?
To a great degree. And in fact, when Hirohito will give different messages when he does announce the surrender later. To the Japanese people, he will say that it's the bomb, both of them, and the fact that the U.S. has the bomb, what he calls a new and cruel bomb, that will inflict incalculable damage and destroy the Japanese people, but also potentially lead to extinction of human civilization. And that's how he justifies it. To the military, however, if you reference the chief of the naval services position, they're just going to bear the bombings. So he has to say something different. So he'll talk to the Soviets. But it's unquestioned that the bomb is persuasive. Otherwise, that is what the people in Japan are talking about, which is why Hirohito will use that.
Mm-hmm. Historian George Pfeiffer talked about the Japan in early August of 1945, because the country was gearing up for the final decisive battle on the home islands, which would have been the first invasion of the home islands since the Mongols about 900 years before, 800 years before. They were under a spell, is Pfeiffer's words. The bombs shook them out of that spell. And it shook enough of their leaders out of that spell to be able to enable, and even then it took the leadership of the emperor to basically steer Japan to the course of surrender. And even as it was, I invite your viewers to go read about the night of August 14th, 15th, 1945 in Tokyo, when a group of officers tried to stop the surrender and how close they came to keeping the war going. Yep. It's high drama of the highest order.
Mm-hmm. And it's worth noting, they estimated 10 million plus Japanese, maybe as high as 20 million, would have died in an invasion, because we would have kept up the fire bombings. We would have, the collateral damage that you saw in every other operation, Pacific or in Europe, would have been brought to Japanese home islands. And I think the more rational leadership knew that.
Mm-hmm. And come to find out after the war, just to put a fine point on it for our British viewers, come to find out after the war that there were orders uncovered in POW camps all over Southeast Asia, that the moment that the Japanese home islands are invaded, you are to, quote unquote, use special measures against the prisoners. In other words, you were going to kill them all. Oh, wow. So all those guys like my family that were captured in Singapore, all those guys that were captured in the 1941-42 battles, they would have been killed.
Wow. Yes.
So, yeah, there were a lot of lives on the line based on what was happening in those critical days of August 1945.
It is a true, there is no black and white in this world. There's only gray. And I think the decision for the bombs is the epitome of that phenomena.
Yeah.
DMG and Greco, just to put a fine point on that, because you're absolutely right, Tim. DMG and Greco summed it up really well. He said somebody was going to die in August of 1945. The question was who and how many.
Yep.
Wow, it's very, very powerful stuff. And again, like you said, it had so many implications on going forward to the modern world. I just want to ask about this second bomb crew, Chris, because obviously they know what the first bomb crew have done, surely, by then. So, again, obviously, I know they're probably separated as well, but do they know what they're going to be doing a couple of days later?
Absolutely. This is another unit. This is another plane out of the 509th. The 509th had a couple of dozen B-29s. Enola Gay Tibbets flew the first mission, boxcar, commanded by a major named Sweeney, who's the guy in the dark jacket. Their target is Kokura in northern Kyushu. When they get there, they find that it's clouded over. So they make a couple of runs and realize this is not going to work. So they go over to Nagasaki, find Nagasaki is clouded over. And at this point, they've got a problem. They're starting to run low on fuel, but the bomb is armed. And nobody's ever landed with an armed atomic bomb. And frankly, they weren't real interested in trying, and for completely understandable reasons. So they're trying to figure out what to do. And then all of a sudden, the clouds open in Nagasaki, just over Nagasaki, just enough to permit visual bombing. And so they bomb Nagasaki, end up flying back to Okinawa, and then later fly back to Tinian in the Marianas. And that's the Nagasaki bomb there.
Yeah, wow.
Because Nagasaki is not as flat as Hiroshima, the bomb has somewhat less effect. It still just devastates the city, which was a major port and naval base. But Nagasaki, there's not quite the whirlwind of death, although it's pretty darn bad. I don't want to minimize that, but there are pockets of people in downtown that survive, depending on the vagaries of the ground and where you are at that moment.
Wow. It's so, I can't, like you have to scratch your head to ask yourself, was this real, sort of thing. It's crazy. Just crazy.
I will say this, just to bring it to today. These photos that you're showing us and the photos of destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been the best evidence and perhaps the best argument against nuclear war ever since. And I would argue that those photographs helped influence in cases where we had near misses for nuclear war, like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody understood, even today, the Hiroshima bomb is the benchmark for nuclear weapons and their potency. So, make of that what you will. High price. I mean, you can argue that as you want, but nonetheless, that's something that should be considered.
But not only that, it's sent us into the changes, big time changes the world from that point on.
Oh, 100%.
Everybody on this planet, yeah. Okay, let's talk about the 10th of August and the Emperor, which I can't say his name, sorry, directs the Japanese. Sorry, go for it.
Yeah, Hirohito.
Yeah, that's the one. He directs the Japanese foreign minister to inform the allies of Japan's intent to surrender, provided that the emperor is allowed to remain in place. So what's that all about? Why does he want to stay in place? And what are the allies' thoughts on that, Chris?
So what it comes down to, and we've touched on this already in some ways, the emperor is a living god. Hirohito will renounce his divinity in the fall of 1945. But the emperor is a living god. In many ways, the emperor is the central figure in Japanese society. And to hold the country together, there was a saying, just to illustrate this, there was a saying in the Japanese army when they were trying to get them to take pills. They'd issue orders, you need to take your malaria pill, whatever. And some people wouldn't do it. Then the officers would say, the emperor desires that you take your malaria pill. Nobody ever didn't take the pill. So for control of the military, control of the society, the emperor is central to that. And Hirohito knows that if he is going to navigate the country, and the Japanese government, it's not just Hirohito, but the Japanese leaders know, if the only way that Japan is going to get this war over and is going to be able to end it domestically is if the emperor stays in place and the emperor uses his authority to steer Japan to and through surrender, which is in fact what happens. The Allies realize, hey, small price to pay at this point. And yes, that's a glib interpretation of it, but it's the Japanese are ready to go. Yeah, we can let the emperor, stay. We're going to go ahead and rewrite that, which happens. We're going to rewrite the Japanese constitution and strip him of a lot of his powers and, make it more of a constitutional monarchy, much more along the British lines, as a matter of fact. But if we need to get this, if this is what it's going to take to get the surrender done, we'll go ahead and accept it. Japanese indicate, hey, will you let us keep the emperor August 10th? Over the next few days, there's discussion over, and the Allies affirm that yes, in fact, we will. At which point Hirohito tells his cabinet it's time to surrender, and records the surrender message and ultimately broadcasts it to the nation Most Japanese on the August 15th, when the broadcast happens, is probably getting ahead of us, have never heard Hirohito's voice. And when they hear this announcement from the emperor, they kneel and they listen as if Hirohito was talking to them in person as opposed to over the radio. So Hirohito was absolutely right to insist that he was the one that could steer Japan to and through surrender, because without him, Japan would have continued the war with all that would have meant.
Yeah, I see what you mean there. Yeah, so that's quite a clever move, really. Yeah. Okay. Again, 14th of August, 1945. Finally, obviously, as we spoke about in the VE Day one. Now, there are celebrations in America for VE Day, but again, the war's not over for America at this point. But at this point, on the 14th of August, it is finally over, symbolically. And so, Tim, what was the feeling like in America on that day, and what kind of celebrations went on?
Literally, it was exactly what you saw in Europe and elsewhere during VE Day. The U.S. finally let loose because, as I alluded during our VE Day episode, this was the end of the war for America. When VE Day happened, unfortunately, the attitude was more like, well, yeah, that's great, but the war isn't over for us. For the Russian people, the involvement of the Soviets, that was beginning a new war. For the British and the Australians and so on, it was the same as for the U.S. So there was equal celebration, particularly in other Commonwealth countries in the Pacific. But in the U.S., it was just jubilation. The famous photo of the sailor kissing the lady that generated all the victory statues to include the one in San Diego. I think I sent you a picture of that one. That was taken on VJ Day, so that was when the U.S. basically let loose.
Mm-hmm. And I think I did forget about that picture. Sorry, Tim. Apologies.
Not a problem.
I'm sure people can look it up. But again, what was the mood like, Chris? Just trying to explain your view on that.
Oh, it was a giant party. Tim is absolutely right. I mean, this scene that we're looking at is replicated in U.S. cities all over the place. And in areas like China. We should not forget that for the United States and for China and for some of these other nations, the war started against Japan, as opposed to continental Europe nations where the German war was the first war and then Japan was added later. For us, it was Japan first with Pearl Harbor, and then a few days later, Germany declared war on the United States. So the idea of avenging Pearl Harbor has been a slogan that has been motivating the Americans all through the war. Of course, China, with the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937 and the Japanese invasion, they're happy that the war's over as well. So for them, that's their perspective. It's a different perspective than what you see. And frankly, I think it influences in some ways the memory of the war in the various Allied countries today.
Mm-hmm. And September the 2nd, 1945 is the formal surrender ceremony, and it's held on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. So there is the Emperor again. So was he involved in this ceremony, Chris?
He was not directly, but he ordered his foreign minister and he ordered his chief of the general staff to go and accept the surrender on behalf of the emperor. Mm-hmm. Actually, that's the Japanese delegation on the deck on the morning of September 2nd, 1945. The guy with the cane is Shigemitsu Mamoru, who is the foreign minister, and then that's Uematsu on the right, just to the right of him. And they're standing there, and then Douglas MacArthur is going to come out, make a few appropriate remarks, and then ask them to sign on behalf of the Japanese. The guy in the back in the top hat, if you want to read a really excellent account, it's quoted in many, many books. MacArthur quotes it in full in his memoirs. has a great account of what it's like to be in that group standing on the deck of the Missouri. And you can see you're surrounded by Allied leaders, including many high-ranking Americans. Joe Stilwell is just out of frame there to the left. And some of the other people that we've talked about are present. Nimitz, for example, is present as well. And the account is that all these Americans, they're staring at them, boring into with their eyes. And yeah, here's Shigemitsu signing on behalf of the Empire of Japan. The body language of the Americans as they're watching this is an interesting study if you actually sit and study this photograph. But this is where the war ends, September 2nd, 1945 in Tokyo Bay.
Yeah. And so why the Missouri? Why that particular vessel, Chris?
The short answer is that, well, they wanted a battle wagon, a battleship to symbolize American power. And it's Harry Truman's home state.
Ah.
So that was where that came from.
Okay.
Coincidentally, for our British viewers, the chairs and the table came from King George V.
Oh, wow.
HMS King George V and several other British ships were in Tokyo Bay as well. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser will sign on behalf of the United Kingdom, and they provided the chair and tables.
Yeah. Tim, do you want to add anything about the surrender?
Well, it was also the Missouri was also the flagship of the Third Fleet. It was Admiral Halsey's flagship, and it provided sufficient space. It was the largest battleship we had, and also security. Taking place on water provided a measure of security from any issues that may come from the land. So those were the other factors for why the Missouri was chosen. And of course, it was located in Tokyo Bay, which was accessible by the Japanese delegation and Allied representatives alike. So many different reasons, but it's ever since been remembered for that, even though it didn't leave service finally until the 1990s.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of conditions were the Japanese put under from this surrender, Tim?
It was unconditional surrender, basically. Unconditional surrender. That was the terms as I recall it. I don't know if Chris had any.
Mm-hmm. But I'm saying, like, as in implications of going forward in the future, of saying, like, Germany would have strict rules put on them, wouldn't they? Like, say, particularly after World War I, about you're not allowed this, not allowed to do this. Is there them kind of stipulations there, Chris?
So the Japanese, and this is a whole this is a whole presentation in itself. The way
I can imagine,
the surrender is stage managed to both end the war and set the conditions for peace. Mm-hmm. Douglas MacArthur will govern Japan as supreme commander for the Allied powers, representing all the Allies. There's not going to be a quadripartite government like there is in Germany. There's going to be occupation zones, but it's not going to be the same type of occupation zone like you have in Germany. MacArthur will have supreme authority over the Japanese. The Japanese will hand over all of their weapons. They will disband the army. They will disband the navy. They will tell us where all of their weapons caches are. They will transport the 5 million Japanese that are still overseas home as soon as possible. And the government, and this is significant, the government, including the emperor, is subject to the orders of Douglas MacArthur. He was given full powers to do what he wanted and needed to do in Japan. Now, granted, there was some guidance from the State Department and from the Big Three over what they wanted to see Japan to be, kind of a liberal democracy, constitutional monarchy, which is ultimately what is built. But the Japanese basically have given over themselves. And that's a very close to a quotation for the last Japanese prime minister of the war. We have given ourselves over to the Allies for them to do with us what they will. Mm-hmm. And that's a very close paraphrase of what he wrote in his memoirs.
And am I right in saying as well, obviously the Japanese, they really don't get involved with any real military operations or anything, or raise their hand to anyone after that, do they? Not really.
No, their constitution that they adopt afterwards is explicitly pacifist. They have a defense force, but that's it. They had no navy, In recent years, given other geopolitical concerns, that's slowly changing. But for the better part of the last 80 years, they've essentially been a pacifist country, and their current government's set up to be so.
Yeah. And again, I want to go back to that photograph, Chris, because I'm going to be looking at this for ages now, and I can see some guys sitting up somewhere in the rafters as well. I mean, I can't imagine what it's like for these guys standing there watching this. This is huge, this implications on the world. It's
just another thought. I mean, you guys brought up, Buckner's Civil War. Chris brought up the 80 years since the Civil War, which was 80 years from the Revolution. That's another thing. So 80 years from the Revolution to Civil War, 80 years from Civil War to World War II, and 80 years from World War II today. That's not that long. Most of these guys were grown up with looking at images, pictures of Lee surrendering to Grand Appomattox.
That's right, yeah.
Now it's the greatest war in human history, which up until 1941 for them was, if it wasn't World War I, it was the Civil War. These guys grew up with this, and now they're witnessing an equally historic moment. So just that had to have been at least at some point in many of their minds. And I even if he never said so, Chris, you'd be the authority on this, I will guarantee you Douglas MacArthur thought about that.
Actually, he did. He put it in his memoirs. He cited examples of occupations gone wrong and lessons that he needed to learn. So yeah, absolutely. And of course, his father, Medal of Honor recipient in the Civil War as well. So he's very much, just like the Buckners. Dad was in the Civil War. Son is in World War II.
Yep.
Well, I just want to say to everybody, firstly, thank you guys. I will come back to you guys in a minute because there's a couple of other little things I just want to discuss before we finish up here. But VJ Day 80, 15th of August, go and celebrate this amazing day. If you're listening to this podcast on this day, because that's when when it goes out anyway, but just celebrate, your freedom and the sacrifice that many of these men and women made so that we now today can walk around and be free. So just always remember that, and take a moment to remember the people that lost their lives as well. But yeah, so Chris, I'm going to come back to you, mate, because obviously, like you said, you have that book that you wrote. So we want to give it. We're not going to give it a shameless plug. Have you got time to grab it and bring it to the camera?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So tell us about the inspiration behind that. One day we'll do a whole podcast on it. But yeah, tell us a little, because you can really see your passion when you're talking about the Pacific theatre, particularly in World War II. And I know you're an American Civil War guy, but you can just see the passion that you have for this time period. So what was it like to get to write that book, and just tell us a little bit about it?
This was incredible. 10th Army Commander is it's a short, I've got some biographical elements, but the heart of it is actually General Buckner's writings. He kept a diary in 1944 and 45, and it's the first full publication of his diary and his letters home to his family during the Battle of Okinawa. Of course, he never got a chance to write a memoir, so this is the closest thing we have to his words on his experiences on Okinawa and things like that. I actually got to know the family through Perryville, my time at Perryville, and through his dad had fought at Perryville.
Yes.
And when I cannot say too much positive about how the family supported me. To the point, one quick story is Buckner's youngest son is still alive. He had been at West Point when his father was killed. And I wrote him and I said, look, I'm getting to the point where your father gets killed. And which was, to be honest, extremely difficult to write. I want to know whatever you want to share with me about how you found out and what you thought. And just know that I'm going to quote it. And if you don't want to tell me anything, I'm fine with that too. I got a paragraph back like this, extremely, extremely vivid, which I put in the book. That's the kind of support that the family gave me, and really proud of how this turned out. And I would, if anybody's interested in the Pacific War, particularly 1944-45, some of the strategic debates we've talked about, he comes up. There's a lot in here that illuminates the Pacific War that you may not have realized otherwise.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And I will leave a link for that amazing book in the podcast description. And one day, Chris, we will do a podcast on that. But all that is left to say, gentlemen, Tim, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And Chris, again, it's an absolute pleasure.
Absolutely. Always great to do these.
And all that is left to say is cheers.